free male who enjoy being a guy, having a girl like me.
Keep it gay, keep it light, keep it fresh, keep it fair. Let it bloom every night. Give it room, give it air. Keep your love a lovely dream and never wake it. Make it happy and be happy as you make it. Let it sing like a nightingale in May. Keep it gay, keep it free, or you'll frighten it away. Take it easy and enjoy it while you take it. Keep it gay, keep it gay, keep it gay. Let's sing. Let it sing like a nightingale in May. Keep it gay, keep it free, or you'll frighten it away. Take it easy and enjoy it while you take it. Keep it gay, keep it gay, keep it gay.
When an irresistible force such as you meets an old immovable object like me, you can bet just as sure as you live, something's gotta give, something's gotta give, something's gotta give. When an irrepressible smile such as yours warms an old implacable heart such as mine, don't say no, 'cause I insist. Somewhere, somehow, someone's gonna get kissed. So on guard, who knows what the fates have in store from their vast, mysterious sky. I'll try hard, ignoring those lips I adore. But how long can anyone try? Fight, 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 fight it with all of our might. Chances are some heavenly star-spangled night we'll find out as sure as we live. Something's gotta give, something's gotta give, something's gotta give.
Hi, everyone. Welcome today. I hope you're all having a fantastic Saturday. Welcome to today's program. My name is Lee Pfeffer, and I am the Manager of Museum Experience here at the GLBT Historical Society. And I'm going to be really brief and let us get to our event this afternoon, but I just wanted to start with a little bit about the organization. I want to start by acknowledging that the GLBT Historical Society is based on Ohlone tribal land, and I invite any Indigenous folks with us to make themselves known and visible in the chat and be recognized as we honor the contemporary and ancestral lives of America's Indigenous peoples. This event is being recorded and will be posted to our YouTube channel and our website. So if you are watching live, we welcome your active participation in the chat and encourage you to post comments, observations, and questions for the participants. A really wonderful opportunity for y'all to say hi is let us know where everyone is tuning in from right now. Before I turn it over, I would like to tell you a little bit about the Society and the work that we do. Founded in 1985, the Gay, Lesbian, Bisexual, and Transgender Historical Society is recognized internationally as a leader in the field of LGBTQ public history. Our mission is to collect, preserve, exhibit, and make accessible to the public materials and knowledge to support and promote understanding of LGBTQ history, culture, and arts in all their diversity. We have two sites that our operations are centered around. We have the GLBT Historical Society Museum, located in the heart of the Castro since 2011, and the Dr. John P. DeCecco Archives and Research Center in the Mid-Market District. While we're closed right now because of the ongoing pandemic, we have a growing array of exhibitions, events, and archival resources online for you to check out at glbthistory.org. Finally, I want to thank all of our members and donors who make our work possible. If you're not already a card-carrying member of the GLBT Historical Society, I invite you to consider joining today. Members get a variety of perks, including a 20% discount on purchases of cool swag from our online store and access to special members-only events, and when we are able to welcome researchers back, special research hours. You can learn more about how to become a member and other ways to support the Society by visiting glbthistory.org/join-give. And I'm going to thank you for being here. And now I would like to introduce our moderator and host for this event. It's Amy Sueyoshi, who is the Dean of the College of Ethnic Studies at San Francisco University. A historian by training, their research lies at the intersection of Asian American studies and sexuality studies. They have authored two books, Queer Compulsions, Race, Nation, and the Sexuality of the Affairs of Yone Noguchi, and Discriminating Sex, White Leisure, and the Making of the American Oriental. Sueyoshi is a founding co-curator of the GLBT Historical Society Museum and served as co-chair of the inaugural Queer History Conference in 2019, hosted by the Committee on LGBT History. So I'm going to bring Amy up now. Hi, Amy.
Hi, Lee. Thanks
Welcome.
so much for having me today. And
you.
thanks to all of you who are here with us today with Melinda Lowe. It's such an honor for me to be in conversation with her. So let me just introduce Melinda to you all, and then she'll begin with a presentation of her book. So Melinda Lowe is the critically acclaimed author of several young adult books, including the historical novel that we'll be hearing about today, Last Night at the Telegraph Club, which received 7-starred reviews. Melinda's debut novel, maybe you've read it, is Ash, a lesbian retelling of Cinderella. It was a finalist for the William C. Morris Young Adult Debut Award, the Andre Norton Award for Young Adult Science Fiction and Fantasy, and the Mythopoeic Fantasy Award, and the Lambda Literary Award for Children's Young Adult, and was a Kirkus 2009 Best Book for Children and Teens. She's been a 3-time finalist for the Lambda Literary Award, and her novels have been selected for many Best Of lists, including the American Library Association's Best Fiction for Young Adults, the ALA's Rainbow List, Bank Street College's Best Children's Books, the Amelia Bloomer Project List, the Locus Recommended Reading List, and the James Tiptree Jr. Long List. Melinda's short fiction and nonfiction has been published by the New York Times, Autostraddle, Foreshadow, the New York Times Book Review, NPR, The Toast, The Horn Book, and multiple anthologies. Before she became a novelist, Melinda was an economics major, an editorial assistant, a graduate student, and an entertainment reporter. She was awarded the 2006 Sarah Petit Memorial Award for Excellence in LGBT Journalism by the National Lesbian Gay Journalists Association for her work at After Ellen. She's a graduate of Wellesley College and has master's degrees from Harvard and Stanford University. Currently, she lives in Massachusetts with her partner and their dog, and this is where she joins us today. So again, I'm so honored to be here with Melinda. If we could all give a warm round of applause for Melinda.
Hi, everyone. Virtual applause, I guess. I'm so sad that I can't do this from San Francisco. I'm stuck in the winter. I'm sure it's much nicer in the Bay Area than here. Thank you so much for that introduction, Amy. And thank you, Lee, and the GLBT Historical Society for having me here today. I was when I wrote this book, you'll see as I go on that I did some research at the GLBT Historical Society when writing this book. So I knew that I always wanted to try and do an event here. So I'm so happy I could do this at least virtually, and hopefully someday I'll get to go back to San Francisco in reality. So I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about the novel, and I'm going to do a little bit of a reading, and then I have a presentation with some of my research notes to show you. So I should just go ahead and get started. So let me see here. So last night at the Telegraph Club, here's my book. It began as a short story called New Year, which was originally published in an anthology called All Out. This is the paperback. This came out in 2018. It is a collection of short fiction, historical about queer characters, and it's edited by Sandra Mitchell. So the short story was called New Year, and it was inspired by two nonfiction books that I read. Rise of the Rocket Girls by Natalia Holt, and Wide Open Town, A Queer History of San Francisco by Nan Ella Millen-Boyd. So these two books have nothing in common with each other, but in my mind, the information in them came together to create a character named Lily Hu. So Lily is a 17-year-old Chinese-American girl who lives in San Francisco's Chinatown in the 1950s. It's the dawn of the space race, so Lily really wants to be a rocket scientist like her Aunt Judy, who works at the Jet Propulsion Lab. But Lily is also starting to realize that she might be a lesbian, and maybe her friend Kath is too. So the two of them start going to the Telegraph Club, which is a lesbian bar in North Beach that features male impersonators. That's what we would call drag kings today. So the book is set against the historical backdrop of McCarthyism in the 1950s, the atomic age, racism against Chinese American immigrants. But at its heart, Last Night at the Telegraph Club is a coming of age novel. It is about Lily discovering her identity as a lesbian, and most of all, it's a love story. So I thought I would start off by reading a bit from the book to give you a taste of the story. I'm just going to move my windows around so I can make sure I can see all the relevant things here. Virtual events, so fun. Okay, so I'm going to start with this scene where Lily has just brought her friend Kath to a drugstore to show her a lesbian pulp novel called Strange Season. Strange Season is fictional. I made it up for this book. But you used to be able to buy pulp novels at drugstores like, Walgreens or whatever. So they go to this drugstore, which is right on the edge of Chinatown, right outside of Chinatown. And she shows Kath this novel. She hopes that by showing the book to Kath, she can figure out if Kath is gay. Okay. Lily spun the rack of tawdry paperbacks again, then began to flip through novel after novel, hunting for the provocative cover of Strange Season. The blonde, that had to be Patrice, in her negligee on the floor, the brunette Maxine with dark eyes, above in her sultry black gown. Lily was aware of Kath beside her, watching, and she said, "It's been here for weeks. I thought it would still be here." Kath pulled a book from the next rack over, a detective novel with the silhouette of a corpse on the cover, and asked, "What was the title? I'll help you look." Strange Season. Kath put the detective novel back and started to look through the other books. When Lily had finished with the romance rack, she moved on to science fiction, wondering if it had been mistakenly placed there, but at last she had to admit defeat. It's gone, Lily said, sighing. I suppose someone bought it. She couldn't imagine who might have had the nerve to put their money down on the counter. Someone very bold. What was it about? Kath asked. When she decided to show the book to Kath, Lily hadn't considered the possibility that it would be gone. She had hoped the book would do the work of voicing the questions she wanted to ask, but without it, she was back where she had started. She was faced with a choice now. She could explain what the book had been about, or she could lie. Kath was watching her expectantly, and there was something in her expression that made Lily hope that perhaps she already knew the book. But Lily told herself that was wishful thinking. In all the time they had spent together, all those walks down Columbus, they had never brought up the Telegraph Club or Kath's friend Jean, not once. Lily wanted to believe that the total absence of those topics signified their importance, but it probably meant nothing. She felt queasy, and Kath reached out and touched her arm. Are you all right? Kath asked. Her fingers pressed lightly against Lily's upper arm. She saw both concern and curiosity in Kath's eyes. They were grayish blue, like the sky covered by a scudding sheet of rain clouds. Lily backed away into the corner between the science fiction rack and the rear wall of the store, and Kath followed her. They were quite alone now, and above them the fluorescent light buzzed as if a mosquito were trapped inside the bulb. It was about two women. Lily's mouth felt so dry she might choke on the words. That book, Strange Season, it was about two women and they fell in love with each other. And then she asked the question that had taken root in her, that was even now unfurling its leaves and demanding to be shown the sun. Have you ever heard of such a thing? Kath's eyes widened briefly, and then she looked down at the floor and over at the science fiction rack and back at Lily, who felt her heart thudding like a drum, her blood rushing through her veins and turning her skin pink as she waited for Kath's response. An eternity seemed to pass. The heat of the fluorescent light on her head was like an artificial sun. The cash register at the front of the store rang like an alarm bell. Finally, Kath said one soft word. Yes. All right, so I'm going to skip ahead just a little bit. The next scene takes place after the scene in the drugstore that I just read. So they have left the drugstore and Lily is now taking Kath to Fong Fong's Bakery and Soda Fountain in Chinatown on Grant Avenue. As they walked through Chinatown, Lily saw the familiar streets with new eyes, and she wondered what Kath thought of her neighborhood. She noticed her looking up at the painted balconies and pagoda rooflines, the red paper lanterns and the gilded or crimson signs thrusting out over the street like pushy Chinese shoppers. Did Kath like it? Or did she find it overwhelming and strange? Kath's face gave little away. She seemed more focused on keeping up with Lily than gawking at the sights. There were obstacles on the sidewalk to navigate around, too. Buckets of iced fish lined up in pearlescent rows, bushels of green and white bok choy, and mounds of gnarled ginger roots, tourists gaping at the glistening roast ducks hanging on hooks in the deli windows. And through it all, there was a cacophony of smells and sounds, bitter herbs mingled with sweet buns, the quick, harsh Cantonese of shopkeepers making deals, the rank background stench of yesterday's seafood. Lily was self-conscious about the smells in particular. She knew that Caucasians wrinkled their noses at the unfamiliar odors. When she spotted Fong Fong's candy cane striped awning a block away, like an all-American beacon between Chinese restaurants and souvenir shops, she hurried Kath toward it as if it were an oasis. She swept ahead and gallantly opened the door for her. Kath seemed a little amused by her behavior, but she entered the soda fountain without comment. Inside, booths were packed along the right wall, and a long, marble-topped counter with stools ran across the back. Behind the counter, soda jerks in white aprons and striped caps concocted ice cream floats and chop suey sundaes topped with fruit and sesame cookies. Lily spotted an empty booth toward the back, and she rushed to claim it, sliding into one of the bench seats as Kath took the one across from her. Lily had been going to Fong Fong's for as long as she could remember, but she still opened a menu. There were hamburgers and French fries, banana splits and ice cream parfaits, Napoleons, and other pastries that could be ogled in the glass case up front. What should I get? Kath asked. Ginger ice cream, Lily said promptly. Kath was looking around the soda fountain as if fascinated, her gaze lingering on the mural of the gingerbread man on the wall behind the pastry counter. This place is something. Lily looked around too, taking in the shining stainless steel cases and the polished marble countertops, the Chinese waiters and soda jerks in their spotless white aprons and striped caps. She felt proud of the place. It made Chinatown seem modern and American. Do you like it? She asked. She had never been to Fong Fong's with a Caucasian. Before Kath could answer, the waiter arrived to take their order, speaking English with a thick Cantonese accent. For a brief, humiliating moment, Kath didn't understand him. Lily had to interpret, and it made her wonder if she should have brought Kath here. Her pride twisted abruptly into embarrassment. After the waiter left, she hurriedly changed the subject and asked, "Are you going to the Spookorama?" Kath shrugged. I don't know. I don't really like dances. I don't either, but I have to go because of Shirley. I joined her dance committee. Why? Kath asked. Lily sighed and glanced behind her. She didn't see anyone she knew in the room. Because it was the only way I could get out of going with Will Chan as his date. Sounds pretty dire, Kath said dryly. Lily pretended to scowl at her. So will you come to the dance? A funny look crossed Kath's face. Lily couldn't tell if it was surprise or reluctance. I have to set up the refreshments, but I don't think I'll have to work the whole night, Lily said, in case Kath had thought they wouldn't be able to spend any time together. Kath blinked, and then she smiled slightly. I wouldn't know what to wear. It took Lily a second to realize that Kath was joking, and then they were both laughing, and somehow Lily couldn't stop. She had to clutch her stomach to contain herself as the waiter delivered their matching stainless steel dishes of ginger ice cream. Kath picked up her spoon and took a bite, and her eyes widened in surprise as she tasted it. This is good. I know. Lily knew she sounded smug, but she didn't care. She spooned up a bite too. The cold, sweet ice cream was studded with small bits of candied ginger. I'll go to the dance if you'll come with me to a GAA meeting, Kath said. What do they do at a meeting? Calisthenics or something? Lily said doubtfully. No, we don't do calisthenics. It's usually tennis or bowling. It's fun. Miss Wayland is the GAA teacher. It's a great group. I'm not so good at tennis or bowling. Well, I've never gone bowling. What? Kath looked shocked. You have to come. Lily spooned up another bite and let it dissolve slowly on her tongue before responding. I wish there was a girls' science club or something. I suppose I could join the regular science club, but it's all boys. I wouldn't want to be the only girl. What do they do in science club? I imagine they do all sorts of things. Chemistry experiments or taking apart engines or, you know what I'd really like to do? Lily leaned forward excitedly. I want to build a model rocket. I saw an ad for a model rocket in Popular Science once. It didn't look that difficult, but the trick is you need some place to set it off. Kath's eyebrows rose. What do you mean? Well, it's powered by a carbon dioxide canister, so it'll launch into the air. She grew thoughtful. I suppose it's a lot like a firecracker. So maybe I could just set it off in the street. Sounds dangerous, Kath said. From her tone, Lily knew Kath was teasing her, and she felt a little flush of pleasure. Oh, it's just a little thing, Lily said, pretending nonchalance. Nothing like a real rocket. I hope I can see a real one someday. Where would you see one? I'd have to get a government job. I've planned it out already. First, I'll go to Cal and major in math. My Aunt Judy did her master's degree in math there, so she knows all the professors. I might need to go to graduate school, but I'm not sure. If I don't need to, I'm going to get a job as a computer at the same place Aunt Judy works. They design rockets there, although she can't tell me much about it because it's top secret. I've read all about rockets already. They already know how to build rockets that could go into space. Well, they have theories about how it could work, but they need to develop better fuels to reach the right speed to leave the Earth. I think they're going to develop those fuels really soon, though. How soon? Kath asked, scraping the bottom of her ice cream bowl. Probably within a couple of decades. I'm sure we'll be sending rockets up into space then. And we can put automatic instruments on board to send back measurements and maybe even take photographs. It'll take longer to send people into space, though. We have to design ships that can withstand potential meteor strikes and maybe even create artificial gravity, because otherwise people will just be floating around the ship. Floating? Why? Because there's no gravity in space. I suppose it must be a little bit like swimming, except with no water. How strange that would be. Is it safe for humans? I don't know. Perhaps. Isn't it exciting? Lily beamed. Kath returned her smile, then shook her head slightly. All right, I'll go to the dance, but you have to come bowling. Deal, Lily said, and extended her hand across the table as if they were making a business agreement. Kath reached out to shake it, but when they touched, it didn't feel like a business agreement at all. Lily suddenly remembered a scene early in Strange Season when Maxine took Patrice's hand to study her manicure and said, "What lovely fingers you have." She snatched her hand out of Kath's and then tried to cover up her self-consciousness by taking her last bite of ginger ice cream. She wanted to ask Kath another question. She wanted to ask her the question, but she couldn't. All around her, the laughter and chatter and tinkling sounds of spoons against sundae glasses reminded her of where she was. This bright, clean restaurant in Chinatown that smelled of sugar and cream was not the place to ask, but Lily felt as if her thoughts must be written in plain English on her face. Are you like the girls in the book too? Because I think I am. All right. So, let's see here. So I have a little bit of a slideshow for you. It's a little weird because I can't actually see anybody reacting, but I'm just going to continue as if that went well. So I first began working on this book in 2017, and I knew from the start that I had a lot of research to do. So I'm going to try to share my screen now and see if I can get this up here. Oops, this does not seem to be up. There it is. Okay, is that up? Looks like it. All right, this is a large stack of research books. So writing a short story doesn't actually require that much research, but expanding it to novel length meant that I had so many more questions I had to answer. I needed to know, for example, what was it like to be Chinese American in the 1950s? What about San Francisco in particular? What was it like to be gay in the 1950s? Not only in the US, but specifically in San Francisco. And most importantly, what was it like to be a Chinese American lesbian in San Francisco in the 1950s? So that was definitely the hardest question to answer because there is such little historical record about queer Chinese Americans. And whenever I came across any little tidbit about a queer Chinese or Asian American, it was often mentioned in passing or in the footnotes. It's almost enough to make you think that like queer Chinese Americans didn't exist back then, but I knew that could not be true. Obviously, what has happened is that our experiences have been erased or marginalized. We've been shunted into the footnotes, literally. And my goal with this novel was to bring us to the center. So that meant that a lot of my research was kind of like detective work. I tried to track down every comment or footnote about a queer Asian American person I could find. And to be honest, there weren't that many. So this is a photo of a page from Wide Open Town. So Wide Open Town briefly mentioned one woman, Merle Wu, during a description of the Forbidden City, which was a Chinatown nightclub. You can see I've highlighted the sentence, which says, San Francisco native Merle Wu remembers that lesbians of color often frequented Forbidden City in the 1950s. This was so intriguing to me, but there was very little about Merle or the Forbidden City in Wide Open Town. However, the footnotes told me that there was a tape recording of the interview that Wu did with Nan Boyd, and it was archived at the GLBT Historical Society. So I knew right away that I would have to go there and listen to that tape recording. I also really hope to find an actual real life Chinese American lesbian or two who had lived through the 1950s in the Bay Area, so I could ask them about their life. And to find one of these wonderful unicorns, I turned to some good old-fashioned networking. So first, I emailed Alice Hom, who co-edited the anthology Q&A, Queer in America. I chose to reach out to Alice because we had interacted on Twitter. So never think that social media is not useful. Alice suggested that I in turn contact a couple of other people. Arthur Dong, who made the documentary Forbidden City, USA about the nightclub, and also Amy Sueyoshi. So Amy told me about Margaret Chung, who was likely the first Chinese American woman doctor in the US. So Dr. Chung had been a doctor in San Francisco's Chinatown in the 1930s and 40s, and she was believed to be queer, although she never officially came out. This was before Lily's time, but because Dr. Chung had been kind of famous, there weren't many women doctors in general, and she was very active in the community during World War II. She did all this outreach to local soldiers, and she called them her fair-haired bastards, which is why the book that Judy Wu wrote about her is called Dr. Mom Chung of the Fair-Haired Bastards. It sounds very strange to us, but it was apparently great during World War II. Anyway, so she was very widely known in San Francisco. And in the novel, Lily's father is a doctor in Chinatown. He even works at the same hospital where Dr. Chung worked. So I imagined that he knew of Dr. Chung. He knew about the rumors about her, and his knowledge influences the way that he reacts when he learns that his daughter is gay. So Amy also connected me with Crystal Zhang, a Chinese American lesbian, one of those unicorns who had grown up in Chinatown in the 1950s and was still in the Bay Area. I was already planning a research trip out to San Francisco in the summer of 2017. And when I reached out to Crystal, she generously offered to meet me in Chinatown and tell me about her life. So here's a photo of me and Crystal on the day we met. Crystal took me on a tour of her Chinatown, and she also told me about growing up there in the 50s and 60s. We're standing in front of the site of her father's old grocery store. So many of the things that Crystal told me influenced the story that I wrote, especially her memories of walking to Galileo High School, up Columbus Avenue, and through North Beach. I took that walk myself at least a couple of times so that I could get a feel for what it might be like for Lily. I also went to the San Francisco History Center at the San Francisco Public Library because they had several of the Galileo High School yearbooks there. So this is the Telescope, their yearbook from 1955. I just want to show you a few photos from them because they are so great. When we think of the 1950s in America, the images that come to mind are pretty white, right? Like Leave It to Beaver. So it was amazing to me to see so many Asian students in the Telescope yearbook. I think it was easily 1/3 Asian at Galileo in the mid-50s. Judging by the names, they were mostly Chinese, but there were also Japanese and Filipino students. So these are some great photos from the 1955 yearbook. We have bowling with the GAA. So GAA is never defined in the yearbook. I'm guessing that it's the Girls Athletic Association. So that's the bowling. The top right is the dance committee at the school. So I love that Asian girl with the ponytail in the front. It really makes me think of the character Shirley in Telegraph Club. And then at the bottom there, you have student council. And I just loved seeing all their faces. It's wonderful. Looking at these photos showed me that these Asian American kids were just normal American teenagers. They dressed like Americans. They wore, bobby socks and poodle skirts. So I think that Asian Americans' American identity is often stolen from us because non-Asians often assume that we are foreigners. But these photos really showed me just how American we were in the 50s. So here's another photo I wanted to share with you. This is a spread from the yearbook, and these two people I circled in red really inspired me in terms of the characters of Lily and Kath. I poured through a lot of these yearbook pages to see what teens looked like in the 50s, and I really connected with these two images. So when I wrote about Lily and Kath, I actually really thought about these faces on my characters. So when I was in San Francisco in 2017, I also, of course, visited the GLPT Historical Society, where I looked through a lot of the Wide Open Town papers. Much of that research in the archives involved reading transcripts of interviews, like this one with Reba Hudson. So some of these interviews were condensed for the book, Wide Open Town, but the transcripts included a lot of stuff that didn't make it in. So basically, personal anecdotes and what I would describe as dyke drama, gossip. Reading these transcripts really gave me a sense of what it was like to be a lesbian in San Francisco in the 1940s and 50s. And it made me realize that even though I am several generations removed from these women, our experiences weren't actually so different on some levels. And there's a good reason for that, because these women in the 40s and 50s created the lesbian bar scene that my generation inherited in the same city. So I lived in San Francisco in the early 2000s, and I definitely spent a lot of time in lesbian clubs and bars. And when I read through the memories of people like Reba Hudson, I saw my own and my friends' experiences reflected back. Here are a few pictures of bars. The one on the left, this is from 1945. That's a photo of the exterior of Mona's 440 on Broadway, which was quite a famous lesbian bar. And then on the upper right are three women in a bar. Incidentally, Grace Miller, I believe, was involved in a bar raid in 1954, and at a bar called Tommy's. And I chose the name Miller for Kath because I took Grace Miller's last name actually for Kath. I had never seen a photo of Grace Miller though until I found this one very recently, basically when I was putting together this slideshow. So I can't say I knew that's what she looked like. And then at the bottom right is a photo of inside the Tin Angel, a jazz bar owned by a lesbian from the late 1950s. So it's fun to see what that might have looked like. Doing all this research made me realize that the geography of San Francisco created kind of a connecting thread for my generation and the generation of the 40s and 50s. The specific bars that they went to were not the ones that I went to, obviously, but the bars I went to were still in San Francisco buildings, often old ones. So they shared the same kind of layout as the 1950s bars, and the community in those bars featured similar personalities. So realizing all this gave me the confidence that I could definitely imagine a 1950s lesbian bar, because in many ways I went to the direct descendants of those bars, and my friends and I were part of a culture that had been created by those earlier generations. So here are some more photos from the Wide Open Town papers at the GLPT Historical Society. I love these photos. These didn't make it into the book, but these are friends from the 40s and 50s, and they're just snapshots, but they showed so much personality and liveliness. You know, I could look at these photos and imagine how real these women were, their senses of humor, how much they obviously enjoyed their friendships and relationships with each other. I had one of these photos, a printout of it, pinned up on my wall while I was writing the book, because the joy on their faces was just so clear. And I wanted to make sure to bring that into the book. I don't have a picture, unfortunately, of Merle Wu's interview transcript. The whole reason I went to go to the archive, because Merle's interview was one of the few that was not transcribed, actually. I should have taken a photo of the cassette tapes because that would really be a historical artifact these days. But I did listen to her interview, and it gave me a wonderful glimpse into her life, the life of a young queer Asian woman in the 1950s and 60s. So Merle talked about how she had worked at I. Magnin, that old department store. Some of you may remember it used to be on Union Square. So Merle worked there in 1959. And in her interview, she says that there were Asian women who worked there. Usually they were elevator girls who wore Chinese jackets. So I just love that detail, and I used that in the book. Merle Wu also said that several of her coworkers, including a manager, were lesbians, and it wasn't a big deal. I thought that was really interesting. So that detail also makes it into the book at a later point. I won't spoil it for you. Merle went on to work at the Forbidden City nightclub, actually, as a waitress for a short period of time, and several of the performers who worked there, she said, were gay. So you might remember that one of the first people I reached out to when I began my research suggested that I contact Arthur Dong, who had made a documentary about the Forbidden City. So the documentary is really wonderful, and if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. There's also an accompanying book in which I saw this amazing photograph. So to me, this is a very queer photo. And I imagine that this performance and this performer, her name was Toy Yat Mar, I figured she must have been known by the lesbian community. In the novel, the character Tommy Andrews, who works as a male impersonator at the Telegraph Club, mentions knowing of a Chinese woman who performed dressed like this, like Marlene Dietrich. So there's no direct confirmation that Toy Yat Mar was a lesbian, but I did email Arthur Dong and asked him if he knew of any gay performers who had worked at the Forbidden City. So none of them were out at the time, of course, but Arthur told me to look at the top photo on page 59. So I'll give you a minute to look there. Does anyone see what I see? If you look very closely, the two women on the right are holding hands under the table. And that is Toy Yat Mar of the Marlene Dietrich suit on the right. She is holding hands with an unidentified woman, according to the caption, which you can't see here, but they make a really cute couple, don't they? I think they're adorable. So when I saw this picture, it was like finding proof, visual proof at last, you know, that look, we existed then. Queer Asian women existed then, and we still exist now. So I have talked for quite a while now. I've really only scratched the surface of the research I did while writing this novel. But I want to bring back Amy, who has prepared some very thoughtful questions. And I think we're going to have a very good discussion. Let me stop the screen share. Okay.
Thank you,
Welcome
Melinda.
back.
Hi. Thank you, Melinda. I just really want to thank you for that fantastic presentation. I can see sort of all the little bits of your research in your narrative, particularly the lesbian who worked at I. Magnin and things like that. So thank you. It's very informative. I have a few questions for you, and I wanted to just remind the audience that they are also welcome to ask questions. We actually have left a significant amount of time to ask questions, so I want to welcome all of you to put questions in the chat group. I don't know if you can see the comments, Melinda, but Crystal Jang actually entered the room.
Oh, hi, Crystal. I wish I could see you in reality, but hello.
There we go. There we go.
I love it.
So my first question, Melinda, is I really appreciated how this book was so much at the intersection of being Chinese American and queer. I feel like much of the fiction out there is queer or Asian American, but never both. While your earlier books felt Asian-y, this one to me seems more explicitly Asian American in grappling with Chinese American history, as well as McCarthyism in the midst of a gay narrative. Can you tell us how you've come to this personally, either as a writer or in dealing with the realities of publishing?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I think that I have definitely evolved as a writer. When I wrote Ash, that was my first novel. It came out in 2009, so I was writing it in the 2000s. Back then, I felt that making the main character gay was a big enough problem for publishing. I felt like if I made her also Asian, it would be too much, and they would definitely not buy it. I was already afraid that just by making it a lesbian Cinderella, that would make it unsellable, because I had never heard of that before. Like, no, I had never read a book like that. I'd never seen that. So I was like, this is crazy. It'll probably never sell. If I make her Asian, it'll be even worse. Because I mean, when I wrote it, when I pictured the characters in my head, they looked Asian, but I was too scared to do it. I was not ready, so I didn't. Huntress, I think, my second novel was pretty Chinese. It relied a lot on Taoism for a lot of its world building and culture, but I wrote it in a way that was not as overtly Chinese on its face. Okay, so I chose names for characters that sounded Asian but were readable for Western readers, and I was still really trying to make it Asian but not too Asian. So that was my second book. So my third and fourth book, my evolution is very obvious. So Adaptation and Inheritance are a science fiction duology set in San Francisco, like in 2011 and 2012, and it includes a straight Chinese American boy as one of the main characters. So he's specifically Chinese American, but he is a boy and he is straight. So actually, I have a funny anecdote to tell you about this. This is Adaptation and Inheritance are kind of X-Files inspired thrillers, and they were really the only ones in my books that had significant interest from Hollywood. So I got into a contract discussion with a producer to make a TV series from that book. And I asked them to put in the contract that David, the Chinese American boy, would be played by an Asian actor, an Asian American actor. And they refused to do that.
Oh,
so
terrible.
That was back then. That was like 2013, maybe. So after that duology, I wrote a psychological thriller. I write all genres, right? So I go all over the place. So my most recent book before Telegraph Club was called A Line in the Dark. And that actually has a queer Chinese American girl as the main character, but it's also a psychological thriller. So people don't seem to notice that she's Chinese American or queer. They just know it's a psychological thriller. The plot is the main thing. I wrote her I was writing directly against stereotypes of Chinese American girls. And maybe that has caused people not to focus on that. It's very interesting that her ethnic identity is often not really noticed in that book. So publishing has certainly evolved just as I have evolved. And with Telegraph Club, it was so obvious to me that the story had to be about this specific girl and this specific culture in a specific time. And I am very fortunate that I have been involved in pushing publishing to be more open to stories about marginalized people. I'm very fortunate to be working with an editor who is also very much at the forefront of that. If you've read the book, you know there is. I did not try to tone down any of the Asianness. I mean, there's Chinese characters in this book. When people speak, they're actual characters, and I really went for it with this book. So I feel like I have certainly evolved, and I think I feel very fortunate to have been able to do that and to keep writing, because a lot of people don't get to do that. They write one book and write another one. So I'm really happy that I'm still here doing it, and I've been able to go this far with this book.
And how has the reception been since you've gone there, so to speak? You really.
This book, I have to say, has had the most positive reactions of any of my books ever. I mean, Ash had a very positive reception, but I have this book has gotten 7-star reviews, which I put in my bio because it's extremely rare for that to happen. I don't want to jinx myself, but like the reviews have been amazing. I feel like people are really getting it, which really heartens me because I know it's such a specific story, but the reviewers are really connecting with it, and they're really getting it. And so I have been so happy with the reception for this book, and it's been overwhelming, almost I have to be honest, because I feel that this is a good book. I feel very proud of it, but you never know how the public is going to react to something. You can't just be like, oh yeah, it's going to be great. Like you never really know. So it's been really, really wonderful.
Excellent. Hana Kadoyama has a specific question I'm seeing in the comments about what your inspiration was. Yeah,
Sure.
What was the inspiration for writing a straight up realistic historical fiction?
What was my inspiration? This story just seemed to come to me. Like I said, it kind of emerged from my interest in early rocket science and San Francisco. And I had been doing research into San Francisco for another book that I have not yet written. And so I had that information in my head when I was reading about the computers at JPL, and it sort of just came together in my head like that. And I was talking to my agent the other day, and I realized that the movie Carol came out right before I started working on this book, I think. So maybe the 1950s were kind of in my head. I'm not sure. Like it's really interesting. People ask you where ideas come from, and I'm never entirely sure. I think I get a lot of different ideas, and they kind of mix around in my brain. And if it's a good idea, it sticks around and it kind of solidifies. But it's not like there's ever one origin. There's a lot of things that come together to build a story. And actually, at first, it was just going to be a short story. I didn't think it was a novel, but it was my agent who convinced me that it was a novel. He thought it could be one. And so I didn't actually initially intend to write a novel, but his suggestion really stuck with me. So
it's great. We need to thank your agent.
That's right. Thank you, Michael. I thank him at all of my events because with this book.
So, in your writing, here's another question that's popped up here, RI05. What was the thought process behind using, quote, Caucasian instead of white in the novel? Was that the term used in the 1950s?
Yes. It was the polite term to refer to white people. I mean, we know that the Caucasian is a completely inaccurate term that does not reflect reality, but that is how they were. That is how white people were identified in the 1950s.
So, Melinda, you have this incredible skill in tapping into so many young adult emotions. Your book resonated with my own younger years, from sneaking out of the house to falling in love, even getting slapped in the face by my mom my junior year in high school. And as I read your book, I feel like I relived all these emotions from my childhood, emotions that I had long and perhaps thankfully forgotten. How do you keep so connected to all these first-time feelings? I wondered if you're like falling in love like a teenager every year to
Thankfully,
be able to.
Thank God I am not. No, I think that with writing, one of the most important things about being a writer is you have to develop the ability to put yourself in other people's shoes and to see the world from different perspectives. I mean, every character in the book I have to have empathy for, and I have to understand where they're coming from. So not only do I have to know how Lily feels, I have to know how Lily's mom feels, and I have to know how Lily's aunt feels, how her dad feels. I have to know how all these people feel, every single one of them, so that I can tell the story genuinely. I think that's just something that comes with practice, because when I began writing, way back when I was a teenager, I actually wrote 3 novels when I was a teenager, like complete novels. They were fantasy novels. They were very, very bad, but they were fun. And the thing that I've had to develop my whole life is how to express emotions in fiction. And it's hard. I gotta say, it's really hard. And some scenes are very draining because I feel like I really embody the characters when I am writing their feelings. So that scene you mentioned, Amy, with her mother, it's a kind of a climactic scene when Lily's mother confronts her. When I worked on that scene, Lily was so upset in that scene. I think I had a headache. I got a horrible headache every time I worked on that scene, and because it was just so painful to go through. So I'm very glad that is over, and I don't have to remember that scene anymore because it was awful to do.
You do an incredible job, though, channeling the aunt as well as the mom, right?
Thank you so much.
So just very moving, yeah. It also reminded me of, how my own mom must have felt coming. She came to the U.S. in the 60s as well, so just felt very moving. You did a great job.
Thank you.
I love that you dedicated your book to, quote, all the butches and femmes, past, present, and future. Can you talk a little bit about that and what this dedication means to you, particularly since among a newer generation of queers, identifying as butch or femme is waning?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. I always feel that although language changes and evolves and is not the same across time, human beings still seem to share experiences across time. So I really think of butch and femme not necessarily as concrete categories, but as ways of experiencing the world. So I feel like female masculinity and queer femininity have always been part of lesbian communities. Like if you think about, if any of you have seen Gentleman Jack on HBO, it was out last year, and it's about Anne Lister, this lesbian in England. I don't think she identified as a lesbian in the early 1800s. I feel that Anne Lister was clearly butch. She wore men's clothing. She had that kind of masculine energy, that kind of female masculinity that is very recognizable in many generations of women. But she didn't use the word butch, but I would still put her in that category, right? Also because I do think that it's possible that butch and femme are going out of style. I don't know. I think that because I write young adult fiction, a lot of young adults contact me. So there are definitely those who still identify as butch and they tell me so. So it's definitely, it still exists as an identity today. And I also think that butchness or female masculinity has always been a kind of resistance to the gender binary. So I feel like I see non-binary and trans-masculine folks as kind of related to butchness, kind of on that similar continuum, or at least engaged in the same struggle, to make space for non-traditional gender identities. And queer femmes are often quite invisible. They're not. I think of queer femininity it's not straight passing so much as ignored or dismissed as valid. So when I wrote that dedication, I really wanted to say to butches and femmes, like some of the characters in the book, I see you and I appreciate you, So really, if you see yourself in that dedication, no matter how you identify yourself with a word, or even if you choose not to use labels, I sympathize with that too. If you see yourself in it, then it's for you.
Yeah, I was particularly moved by this passage that you wrote where Kath is called a baby butch by Rhonda. And then this is on page 198. You wrote, there was a hint of a smile in Kath's eyes, and Lily realized she was trying to hide the fact that she was pleased. Rhonda had apparently paid Kath a compliment, and Lily felt an electric clutch in her belly as she recognized it. Butch, like a blue ribbon awarded at the county fair, and baby, like a promise. I just thought that was so beautifully written. Like,
Thank you.
I think many of us were called Baby Dyke, right, as we were coming
Yeah.
out, right? And so the thought of promise as well as blue ribbon, I never would have articulated it as such, but thinking about it as a county fair was really just moving to me. Yeah. So thank you. I have one
Thank
more
you.
question. One more question. And then I'm going to let sort of that there's a whole bunch of questions coming in the comments. So we'll turn to those after that. So without spoiling the ending, how do you feel ideologically about happy endings? You clearly made a choice about the ending for this book, and I suspect it's very much informed by your understanding of lesbian pulp fiction that Lily and her barmates were also reading.
Yeah, so as a writer, I feel like I have to always be in service to the story I'm telling. So sometimes that story has a traditional happy ending, and sometimes it doesn't. So if you look at my body of work, not every novel has a happy ending. But as a lesbian writer who is aware of pulp fiction and also of so many horrible things in media where gay people die all the time for no reason, the one thing I do is I do not punish queer characters for being queer. I will never do that. I think that sometimes some characters do bad things and they, have to suffer the consequences, but they're not going to be punished for being queer in my books. So I guess that's my philosophy on endings.
Great. So we have a couple of questions coming in. This is from Hallie Hicks. Here, thank you. Huntress was the first book with lesbian MCs I ever read. It was such an amazing experience to read an LGBTQIA+ love story. Thank you. Any writing advice for an aspiring lesbian fantasy author?
Yes, absolutely. You should keep reading. There's so much good stuff out now. There's so many more LGBTQ+ fantasy novels. It's pretty amazing how many more there are now. And you should read them. Read things that you like, and read what you're drawn to. And I think that one thing I always try to tell writers is that it can be very, very hard. And a lot of people are going to tell you should give up because it's not a very lucrative job and there's no security in it. And all that is true. However, don't give up. This is why I tell them, don't give up, because you are the only one who is going to believe in you. So you have to do it. You have to believe in yourself and don't give up.
Can you talk a little bit about when you were writing Ash? I presume that you were working, you had a full-time job, and also if you could talk a little bit about your family, because many of us might have parents who don't think of writing as a stable career.
Yeah. My parents told me directly.
Okay.
I always wanted to be a writer. I from my very youngest time, I wanted to be a writer, but my parents told me directly, you cannot be a writer. They told me that. They told me I needed to have a job, and I understand what they meant, and I mean, they're correct. I had to have a job. It was really difficult. I think that I know that they meant well, but it really stopped me from pursuing my dreams for a while. I tried to do other things, and it didn't work out because I just wanted to be a writer. There was really only one thing I wanted to do. And eventually I was in the position of, I was in grad school, and I hated it. I really hated grad school. And I made such little money in grad school that I knew I could make more, even if I dropped out to be a writer. So I did. I left it to become a freelance writer. And I had no idea what that meant. I did not really do any good research about it. I didn't look into things. I had to do it. And I was very lucky. I had good friends who helped me out. One friend worked at a consulting company, and she hired me to write reports for her company. That was very tedious, but it paid pretty well. It was corporate writing. I was a writer. I was a paid writer for the first time in my life, really. And I kept working on that. And eventually I started writing for LGBT media. I was in San Francisco. I worked at Curve magazine for a while. I had a column in the Lesbian News. I don't know if anyone remembers that.
LN, it was called.
Yes, I can't
Yeah.
believe I did that. And then another friend from college started After Ellen, which in like 2002 or 2003, which was going to be like an entertainment weekly for lesbians and bisexual women. And so she called me and she was like, "So, Melinda, you dropped out of grad school to be a writer. Why don't you write for my website?" I was like, this website gets no visitors. But I did. I wrote After Ellen's first article about Ellen DeGeneres. And I kept working there, and the website got really big. And my friend, she sold it to MTV. So by like 2006, it was huge. And I was a full-time entertainment reporter. I had not anticipated doing this with my life. Like, this was a job I fell into by accident, but it was fascinating. It was just fascinating. And at the same time, I was writing Ash. I had always wanted to retell Cinderella because my favorite novelist when I was a kid had never done that. My favorite writer when I was a teenager was Robin McKinley, and she retold a lot of fairy tales, but never Cinderella. So I was like, all right, I will write the book that I wanted to read. So I was working on Ash, and I was working at After Ellen full-time back then. It was more than full-time. It was a lot of work. And to work on Ash, I would stay in on Friday nights and work on my novel for like hours. I mean, we could stop working Friday afternoon because of the way the internet worked. We didn't have to post anything more on Friday afternoon. So I would work on Ash Friday afternoon and Friday night. So I gave up like a good like 2 years of Friday nights in San Francisco as a single lesbian working on Ash. So I sacrificed to write that book. I gave up so much social time at lesbian bars to write that book. And so yeah, that's how I did it. I worked on it at night after work.
And would you say that it was only those Fridays? You didn't have to write on the weekend? So if Allie wanted to just start writing on Fridays after work, she could finish her book?
You can also write on the weekends. I think I would like carve out time. You know, sometimes I would take a vacation, and I went one time. I remember I stayed at my friend's house in the Sunset for a week when they were on vacation, and I went and stayed there as a writing retreat. You know, I would do that.
Yeah.
Yeah. One winter I stayed at home over Christmas by myself alone and worked on my book. Like, this is what I did for years. So you have to, I think it's about, if you're working full time, the secret is really to carve out a regular routine, even if it's only 1 hour a week. Just keep that time for your writing and make sure you go back over and over and over again. Because even if you only write 250 words, next week you'll write another 250 words, and it adds up.
Thank you. So RI05 says, what would you say are the differences between writing a young adult novel versus a non-young adult novel for adults? Why did/does the young adult genre call to you more than writing adult fiction?
To be honest, it doesn't, because I didn't write Ash as a young adult novel. I just wrote it as whatever it was. And when I wrote it and sent it out on submission, Ash was in her 20s in the book. And then it sold as a young adult novel, and the publisher told me that she had to be younger. She couldn't be old. Basically, she couldn't be older than 18. So I just made her younger, but I didn't change anything. So everybody else is the same age. So if you get too into if you think about it too much, she's having a relationship with a much older woman in Ash, because nobody else's age changed. And honestly, I'm not sure that, I mean, there are differences, but let me tell you. So this book is published as YA in the United States. It's coming out in the UK on March 18th as an adult novel. It's the same book. So yeah. I'm not sure what the difference is.
I think it might be about marketing.
It might be about marketing. Okay. And because I've been writing YA for so long, like this is where it is at this point. So, but I have adult fiction in me too. I know I do, because at some point you've got to you've got to grow older, and adults have different problems than teenagers.
So Lori Lai said, I liked your comment that there were Chinese Americans who are just as much American as many other ethnic groups who could have been in California for 3 to 4 generations by the 1950s. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, yeah. It's so interesting because Lily is a second generation American, but in a lot of the when this book first came out, before people had read it, a lot of the promotional, like the stuff that when books come out, publishers send it out to many reviewers, book bloggers, people all over the place, and they kind of promote it. And at the beginning, people kept identifying Lily as an immigrant. And I found that really interesting because she's not an immigrant. She's born in America. Her mother was also born in America. Her grandmother was an immigrant. And then on her father's side, her father is an immigrant. So what does that make Lily? I still think that makes her an American. You know, I think that it's, yeah, absolutely. I mean, Chinese Americans, many of them have been in America for a very long time. And I wanted to reflect that in Lily, but I also wanted to note that after World War II, there was an influx of some Chinese from the mainland as they were fleeing communism. So that's part of her story too.
For sure. What else surprised you during your research, especially at the GLBT Historical Society? Did you come across anything interesting about other Asian American groups in San Francisco?
You know, there's more research on queer Asian American groups in the 70s and 80s. And so that stuff is great, but it was too late for my book. So I enjoyed looking at some of that, but it was too late for my book. So honestly, I didn't find that much stuff about queer Asian Americans. There was a lot of interesting stuff about Asian American history. There's so much around immigration and McCarthyism and how the FBI and the INS were really on the streets harassing Chinese immigrants in the 50s during the Korean War. And I didn't end up putting too much of that in the book, but I in one iteration of the book, there was a whole subplot about this that got way bigger, but that didn't work out.
Great. There's a comment from SSY. It says, I love what you said about empathy. Fiction does this, which is really good for society, but people are reading a lot less. Are there other ways folks of color and queers can share and imagine with power and impact?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I think that we can talk to other people. We can talk to our friends and our family. You know, I know that my family, for instance, doesn't read a lot of English language fiction because they may not read English as fluently. And so I remember during the election, there were all these efforts to put together resources for Asian American or elders, you know, to understand things like Black Lives Matter, because the Chinese language press in the United States can be quite racist. And so that is something I think we can do, reach out to our family. If you feel comfortable doing that, that can be really hard to do. I did send some material to my dad to share with my family, and he said he would do it, but they were not changed. But I think that the thing is, we have to keep trying, right? Because they are our family. And I think that although reading may be declining, that doesn't mean we just roll over and let that happen. No, I mean, tell your friends to read things. I think that would be great. I think there are a lot of people haven't read books. A lot of marginalized people of color, queer people may not have read books because they were all about straight white people. I have to tell you, reading a book about queer characters and Asian American characters is like night and day from reading a book about a straight white person. It's very strange, because if you have never read books with characters that come from your background, it's shocking. You're like, what am I doing in this book? This is so weird. It's both frightening and really affirming, actually, at first, because you're not used to it. And then
Yeah.
if you read enough of books about people like you start to realize this is what straight white people feel like
Every
all the
day when
time
they read.
when they read. They're like, they're normal, you know? And
Yeah.
I think that there's been a lot of progress, especially in YA and children's literature and developing fiction with characters of color. And I think that is starting to move into adult fiction. So I think there's just going to be more out there for those of us who are not white and straight to identify with and to enjoy. It's a lot easier to enjoy a book where you are included and you're not like the racist joke. It's great. It's just really great.
I remember in high school I had to read Catcher in the Rye as a coming of age
Awful.
story, and I was just thinking if I was reading Melinda Lowe in high school, that would have just been incredible. So you're absolutely right that it's both jarring and moving. And I do wonder, like, I guess other folks don't have this moment where like, oh my God, I see myself in the book. And, you want to like throw everything in the air. You're so shocked about it. So thank you very much. There's probably a number of teachers on this call. And I've been encouraging, fellow colleagues to assign this book. And in a lot of history classes, faculty do like to assign fiction.
That's great.
And yeah, so I remember when I was a grad student, there was a person who was teaching history of the West who was assigning Lisa C. So I'm hoping that he'll assign Melinda Lowe instead. But Jenny Bowman has a question. I'm wondering if we should ask our Asian students if they have elder relatives that might have been LGBTQ plus. Should they be asking them to do interviews with them?
Oh, I think that would be so valuable if they feel comfortable with it. And if, it depends on their personal situation, right? And whether their elderly relatives are comfortable with it as well. Because I think there's really a risk of losing all that experience and knowledge. I think for queer people in general, this is a problem. We don't have a lot of elders. And I was just reading Roxane Gay's blog she wrote a post about this yesterday on her newsletter, The Audacity. You can find it. She has a post on elders, and it's true. There's not a lot of elders to look up to, and I think it would be really wonderful to have more of those perspectives recorded. But it depends on their personal family situation and how comfortable they are. Like I wouldn't want to have force anyone to come out, because still in a lot of Asian American families, it is not okay to be gay. And I think for older generations, they might keep that feeling closer than younger ones.
Great. So we have a little bit more time. I want to encourage people to keep the questions coming. In the meanwhile, I have more questions for you, Melinda.
Okay.
So I love the use of Chinese in your novel, particularly your use of Chinese characters and not pinyin. I thought that was brave and super assertive, like, I'm proud to be a Chinese American. You may already know that Chicana theorist Gloria Anzaldúa got a lot of pushback from her editor for having so much Spanish in her book Borderlands, which was first published in 1987. Did you face any pushback from your editor regarding the use of Chinese language?
No, I didn't, because my editor is awesome. He is fantastic. And the Chinese came because I was writing this historical novel, right? So I knew there would be Chinese spoken, and I wanted to put it in the book, but I didn't quite know how, because pinyin didn't exist in 1953. So Mandarin was Romanized with the Wade-Giles system, which is a little bit weird. That's why Peking is from the Wade-Giles system, Peking as opposed to Beijing. But also there's a lot of Cantonese spoken, and Cantonese never has had any standardization in terms of Romanizing. So if you trying to Romanize Cantonese is like, it's impossible. Like you can do it, but then it just looks like some made up language, which it's not, it's a real language. And I realized that by using the actual characters, I could avoid that Romanization problem, because the characters are the same. and they're the language. You look at, when you see the Chinese characters, you see Chinese. Whereas all the romanizations of Chinese were for the Western benefit. That's not the actual language. That's written for Westerners. So in some cases, there is romanization used when the characters speak kind of Chinglish to each other, and there's like one Chinese word thrown into an English sentence, and that makes sense to me. But when they're speaking full sentences, it's the Chinese.
Yeah. And I saw my own my dim sum Chinese that I know, like Dan Tat and Cha Siu Bao.
Yeah.
So it was very resonated in that Asian American sort of way, even though I'm not Chinese. So Joey Shoji has a question. Not to take away from your current book, but what's next for you? Works and projects, and then speculative fiction, young adult or not young adult?
So I'm working on my next novel already. It's actually quite far along, and my next novel is set in 2013. It's kind of strange. It was supposed to be set in the present time, but then the pandemic happened, so we decided to set it in the recent past in a meaningful year. So and it's so that's a realistic novel. It's not a genre fiction at all. But I loved writing historical fiction so much. I don't think 2013 is really historical, but I loved writing historical fiction so much that I absolutely want to write more in the future. So I have a definite plan for that, which
Excellent.
Hopefully I can get to later this year. So.
Excellent. So Anna Ang has a question. Did you research any Asian or Chinese cultural sources for LGBTQ paths?
The problem with the researching Chinese sources is that my Chinese is not fluent. Like at one point I could read much more Chinese than I can now because of my extensive years in grad school that I hated, but I still cannot read Chinese that well. So I couldn't do much research at all in Chinese. I'm not sure if that's exactly what you're asking, but I don't actually think there would be Chinese resources about being LGBTQ in San Francisco in the 50s, because that's where I was focused. So I'm sure that there are Chinese resources about queer Chinese people in China, but that was outside the scope of my book. And I tried to limit myself because I love research so much. I could have just gone down this really long rabbit hole into 5,000 years of Chinese history, which I did not need to do. So I held myself back.
Great. Crystal Jang wrote, also love the use of traditional Chinese characters, even though I had to look them up. I remember also in your notes that you said you didn't use simplified Chinese because obviously it wasn't around at that time. Yeah. And your notes are actually really illuminating about your choice of language, the way you decided to use traditional Chinese. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, I decided to use traditional Chinese because, as you said, the simplified characters weren't in use in the 1950s. And even if they had been in use, they wouldn't have been used in America because at that time, Chinese in America had to be very heavily aligned with Taiwan, the Republic of China, not the People's Republic of China, which is where simplified Chinese characters are used today. So they would have been using complex or traditional characters anyway. So when I learned Chinese, I went to Chinese school, of course, as a kid, and I had to learn both. And then when I went to college,
that's twice as much work.
Yeah, and then when I went to college, I also feel like I had to learn both. I don't know why I had to learn both, but I somehow did. It's actually, yeah, I feel for myself in retrospect.
So Jacqueline Quino has a question for you. What queer, lesbian, gay media did you read or watch that helped you come out as a young person?
Oh my God, nothing. There was nothing. When I came out so long ago, when I was in college in the early 90s, there was nothing that I could watch. I mean, there were a few movies. There was like Desert Hearts. That did not make me want to be gay. There, like Personal Best. No, none of these movies spoke to me. It was really just trying to discover it on my own. Like, I had a lot of friends who came out, and that's really how I realized that it was a possibility. And it's so funny. Like, all of the friends I kept from high school turned out to be gay. We were not gay when we were friends, but later on, we all turned out to be gay. Interesting, right? So yeah, there was nothing. It wasn't. But I will tell you a book that made me realize that I could write gay books that were like unapologetically queer. That was Tipping the Velvet by Sarah Waters, which I read for the first time in the early 2000s. And that Tipping the Velvet, it has clearly been an influence on this book because of the male impersonator. So
yeah, very interesting. The book that I read coming out was Well of Loneliness by Radcliffe Hall.
That's a terrible book to read. Terrible.
But that's also, I mean, I was going to say it's historical fiction, but it's actually just fiction written at an earlier time.
Yeah.
Yes. Let's see. Okay, so I have another question for you. Okay, so, you've talked already that you're reading a lot of fantasy, and I'm sure you're reading also many of the other queer of color fiction, who are also, basically storming the publication world of the new millennium. And I'm thinking of someone like Alex Sanchez, who writes on gay Latinos, and Fred Smith, who writes on gay Black men. But just curious, do you folks all kick it together like in a Paris and salon, or where do you see your work fitting in with other queer of color fiction writers?
Oh my gosh, I feel like that I'd have to leave that up to the critics to figure out where my work fits in. I mean, when I do events normally, and I go to conferences, or to book festivals, we do hang out. It's great because I feel like a lot of the queer writers know each other. The writers of color know each other. We always end up at the same tables, so it's really wonderful. There are very few queer Asian writers and I think I know most of them, or I know most of them. I know of most of them. So I don't know. I hope that my work fits in with them. I feel like when I think about where my work comes from and it's like, it's not like lineage necessarily, but the influences, I mean, all of the books that influenced me were unfortunately written by white people. Because not that they were bad, but I was, because that's what there was to read. And so now I think being part of this writing now and finding so many more writers who are of color and queer simultaneously, it's just wonderful. And I'm trying to read more of them. And I think we're making a new kind of community that hasn't existed before.
Yeah. And what do you folks talk about when you hang out? I'm just curious. I just want to be that fly on the wall.
What do we talk about? What do we talk about?
Plot lines, or just
we talk about boring things. We talk about like publishing and like the business and like, do you like your agent? We talk about very boring things. So, maybe it's exciting for some. It's exciting for us, but because we're in the business, so it's very rare to find people that you can connect with as professional and also have those personal identity connections. So it's fun to connect.
It's so funny. There's a number of folks writing in their first books that they read also. Crystal Jang says her first book was also Well of Loneliness, that she swiped from the racks of the North Beach Library. Anna Eng is saying that her first book was Ruby Fruit Jungle by Rita Mae Brown. So just as a last question, can you tell us what you're most proud about in the completion of this particular project?
Wow. With this book, I feel like I put my all into it. I really feel like I worked so hard on this book. I mean, I feel this, I work hard on every book, but for some reason, this one really was hard. And I feel like I tried extra on this one. And I'm so proud of the finished product. This is going to be very, I don't know if this will make sense for anyone, but in this book, the best experience I had writing was writing the second Aunt Judy scene when Aunt Judy takes Lily to Ocean Beach. That chapter was so rewarding for me to write. It came late in the process, and I knew I had to put something there that had to be meaningful, that had to connect one part of the book to another. And I wrote it over a couple of days, and it's pretty much what it was when I first wrote it. I was very surprised when it came out, and it felt like all the work I had put into it had emerged at that moment in that scene. And for me, that's the most meaningful scene for me, and the one that I am the proudest of. It speaks to me on a lot of levels, and I think there will be echoes of it in my work to come. So that's the scene that I love the most. But I'm so proud of this whole book. I really feel like I took myself to another level. I leveled up. Is that what they say in video gaming? I feel like I leveled up.
Joey Shoji says, please put in more food scenes in all your works. Yeah.
No worries. I will always have food.
So I just want to thank you again. Lee's going to close officially with a few reminders, but I want to thank you again for sharing your book with all of us, for allowing me to be in conversation with you, for giving me the privilege of being able to read this book. I told you earlier that I love the book so much that I was literally just reading it as slowly as possible so I could just hang on to it as long as possible. So I want to really thank you for that. Very moving. I mean, even thinking about reading the book gets me a little bit teary-eyed just because it's such an
thank you,
incredible
Amy.
word.
Thank you so much. Because you were really helped me out at the beginning. I mean, it may have just seemed like an email, but it really helped me out a lot. So thank you so much for your early response and for being tonight. I really appreciate it.
Sure. And I'm hoping that, folks will assign it in their classes. So young Asian American pups and young queers coming up can read your book and find a better coming of age story than Catcher in the Rye.
And the Well of Loneliness.
Loneliness, yeah. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Lee to remind us of all the good things that we should do after we get off this call.
Hi, thank you. All right, I'm gonna say goodbye to everyone this evening. Melinda, thank you so much for joining us tonight, and Amy, thank you so much for connecting us. I'm so glad that we got to do this event. So I'm just gonna let you guys all know about a couple of different reminders. So first off, you can find more about Melinda's books at her website at melindalow.com. And you can also sign up for her newsletter here at lowandbehold.substack.com. And some of you may already know about this, but we have books now that we have on our bookshop.org page. We have a shop on bookshop.org, which supports independent bookstores. And you can go to our page and purchase a copy of Last Night at the Telegraph Club that will give some proceeds to the GLBT Historical Society. And if you send an email to me, I've put my information in the ticket. If you send a copy of your ticket from today, as well as your receipt for your book, Melinda has graciously offered to send signed book plates. So please feel free to go ahead and get yourself a copy if you haven't already, and enjoy a personalized, wonderful book plate from our lovely author. And last thing I'd like to mention is if you'd like to see more of these types of events and support us, you can go to glbthistory.org/memberships. And I'm going to say goodbye and thank you to everyone. There was wonderful comments going on in the chat, really great conversation, and I hope everyone has a safe and happy weekend. Bye, everyone.